For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of the 352nd Artillery Regiment, the morning began like any other on the Normandy coast. A thin, damp mist hung over the English Channel, muffling the world in a gray stillness. The air was cold, filled with the familiar scent of salt and wet earth, a sensory monotony that had defined his life for months. It was just after 5 a.m., another watch, another day of anxious, weary waiting. But through his binoculars, as the first hint of dawn tried to break the horizon, the sea began to change. It wasn't the predictable shift of the tide or a rolling weather front. It was something entirely impossible. A dark line had appeared where sea met sky, a smudge that just kept growing, sharpening and multiplying. This was not merely a fleet. It was a city of steel, a floating metropolis sailing relentlessly out of the mist and straight into history. At that moment, before a single Allied soldier set foot on the beaches below, before the world even knew the names Omaha or Utah, Klaus Richter, the pragmatic engineer and soldier, knew the Reich was about to drown. To grasp the visceral shock of that morning, one must enter the mindset of Fortress Europe in the spring of 1944. From the coast of Norway down to the Spanish border, German engineers had labored to construct the Atlantic Wall. It was conceived, promoted, and believed by high command to be an impenetrable chain of concrete and steel, bristling with guns, an absolute barrier against any invasion. In the collective mind of the German leadership and in the propaganda fed to the soldiers, the wall was proof of the Reich's unassailable power. But Oberleutnant Richter, a professional soldier and a grim veteran of the Eastern Front, knew the sharp difference between propaganda and reality. At 32, he was old enough to remember a different, more peaceful Germany, and young enough to have been forged in the white-hot furnace of the war. He was pragmatic, deeply observant, and profoundly tired. His command was a battery of solid, Czech-made cannons nestled in concrete casemates a few miles inland from the beaches the Allies would soon codename Omaha. From his observation post, a concrete bunker sunk into a high bluff, he had a commanding and desolate view of the sea. Day after day, he and his men drilled. They calculated firing solutions, meticulously maintained their guns, and stared out at the gray, empty water. The talk was always of the invasion, der Tag X, the day of days. But when would it come, and more importantly, where? German intelligence, crippled by Allied deception, was certain the main attack would land at the Pas de Calais, the shortest point across the Channel, the logical choice. That is where the 15th Army, the bulk of Germany's defensive strength in the West, was waiting. Normandy was considered a sideshow, a spot for a diversionary landing, but certainly not the main event. This was a massive strategic miscalculation, the lethal result of Operation Fortitude, the brilliant Allied deception campaign, and it left the actual Normandy defenders dangerously exposed. Richter's own unit, the 352nd Infantry Division, was better than most in the area, a rare full division near Omaha Beach, but it was still just a shadow of the elite forces that had conquered France 4 years earlier. Its ranks were a sobering mix of seasoned veterans from the East, like himself, and a larger number of very young teenage conscripts and older, quickly mobilized reservists. They were brave and dutiful, but they were not the stormtroopers of 1940. They were defenders tasked with holding a line that was stretched far too thin. The Atlantic Wall itself was more of a patchwork than a solid shield. Many bunkers were incomplete, minefields had dangerous gaps, and the vast distances meant even a powerful strong point could be isolated and bypassed. Richter knew this reality intimately. He had seen the shortcuts local farmers still used, the blind spots in the fields of fire. He harbored a deep professional skepticism about their chances against a truly determined assault force. In the weeks leading up to June, the tension had been a living, breathing thing. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, tasked with improving the coastal defenses, had been a whirlwind of frantic activity. He ordered millions of mines and thousands of jagged steel obstacles, known to the men as Rommel's asparagus, placed on the beaches. Rommel understood a crucial truth that the High Command in Berlin seemed determined to ignore. If the Allies weren't defeated on the beaches in the first 24 hours, the war in the West would be irrevocably lost, as Allied air power would instantly shred any German reinforcements trying to move to the coast. The first day was the only day that mattered. But on June 5th, the weather intervened. A strong storm blew in with high winds and rough seas. The German Meteorological Office confidently predicted an invasion would be impossible for days. This forecast provided the psychological assurance that allowed many senior officers to relax. It was the reason Rommel himself wasn't even in France. He had gone home to Germany for his wife's birthday, secure in the belief that the storm would keep them safe. And so, as Richter stood watch in the pre-dawn chill of June 6th, the mood was routine, the vigilance dulled by certainty. The storm had passed, but the sea was still choppy. No one expected a thing. He was looking east when he first saw it, a mere flicker. He raised his powerful Zeiss binoculars and focused. His heart, which had been beating in the slow, methodical rhythm of a night watch, began to hammer wildly against his ribs. It wasn't a flicker. It was ships, not a patrol, not a raiding party, but hundreds of them, and behind them, more and more still. He swept his binoculars left and right. Everywhere he looked, it was the same. The sea was no longer gray water. It was a solid mass of dark, menacing shapes, a profound, cold dread. The feeling of a man looking at a math problem he could not possibly solve crept up his spine. For a long, paralyzing moment, Richter's mind simply couldn't process the image. The sheer scale was an insult to military logic. German intelligence had estimated the Allies might muster 3,000 vessels for an invasion, and even that was supposed to be a monumental, nearly impossible effort. What he was looking at was something else entirely. He tried to count, but it was a fool's errand. His brain, on instinct, began to categorize the hulking silhouettes of battleships and cruisers, swarms of smaller, faster destroyers circling them like wolves, and then the endless, uncountable others. Landing craft of all shapes and sizes, packed so densely they looked like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The official number for the entire operation would later be confirmed at nearly 7,000 vessels, an armada from 8 different nations, still the largest amphibious invasion force in history. But to Richter, it was not a statistic. It was a physical, overwhelming presence that seemed to bend the horizon. It was a declaration of industrial power so immense that it rendered everything he had ever known about warfare utterly obsolete. Germany had built a wall of concrete. The Allies had responded by building a bridge of steel. He grabbed the field telephone, his hand slick with sweat. "This is Richter at Observation Post 4. I have a visual on the channel. There are ships." The voice on the other end, from a weary corporal, was tired and dismissive. "We have reports of a few ships, Oberleutnant. A possible raid. Stand by." "No," Richter's voice was strained, urgently cutting through the static. "You don't understand. It's not a few ships. It is thousands. The entire sea is covered from horizon to horizon. This is it. This is the invasion." There was a long pause of sheer, arrogant disbelief. Richter could almost hear the man picturing him as a hysterical junior officer spooked by shadows. "Oberleutnant, the sea conditions are not suitable. Our reports show—" "Your reports are wrong," Richter shouted, his voice cracking with a desperate urgency. "I am looking at it with my own eyes. For God's sake, look at the sea." He slammed the phone down in an act of frustrated futility. The reality was simply too big to be believed. He tried another line to regimental headquarters, finding his commanding officer. "Richter here, sir. The invasion fleet is here. 10,000 ships." He knew he was exaggerating, but in that moment, it felt like an understatement. The major's voice was skeptical, but now tinged with doubt. "Richter, are you certain? The weather is clear enough to see the end of the world, Major, and it is sitting in the English Channel, requesting permission to open fire." The chain of command was paralyzed by a failure of imagination. Their plans, their maps, their intelligence reports, all of it was being erased by the physical reality floating a few miles away. While Richter was watching the massive fleet, the High Command was still focused on misleading reports of scattered parachutists inland, assuming those were the main event. No one was looking at the sea. Richter didn't wait any longer. He shouted orders to his men. Roused by the commotion, they stared out from their concrete positions, their faces a mixture of slack-jawed awe and dawning terror. They saw what he saw. The drills were over. This was real. The heavy shells were brought up from the magazines. Rangefinders called out numbers that seemed impossibly large. The giant barrels of the cannons, silent for so long, elevated slowly, pointing their noses toward the impossible fleet. Richter stood in his post, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the landing craft begin to form up. He could feel the vibration in the air, a low, incessant hum of thousands of engines. It was the sound of a superpower breathing, and he was about to throw the first stone. The order finally came just before 6 a.m. Engage at will. For Richter, it was a release. The paralysis of disbelief was violently broken by the familiar cold clarity of action. "Fire!" he roared into the telephone. A moment later, the ground trembled as the first gun fired, then a second and a third. The shells screamed out over the water. Richter tracked them through his binoculars, a surge of professional pride mixing with his dread. He saw plumes of water erupt in the midst of the fleet. A miss, then another. His men were good. They adjusted their aim, firing with a disciplined, practiced rhythm, and for a brief, electric moment, they made their mark. Richter saw a direct hit on an American destroyer, the USS Corey. There was a flash of orange and a puff of black smoke. The ship listed, crippled, and later sank. A cheer went up from his men. For a few minutes, it felt like a real battle, a validation of their training, but the feeling was brutally fleeting. After the Corey was hit, the fleet did not scatter. It did not slow down. The gap in the formation was instantly filled. The endless lines of ships kept coming, an iron tide that simply could not be stopped. Richter felt a profound sense of futility wash over him. He was a man with a bucket trying to empty the ocean. He looked past his own shell impacts and saw the larger picture. The Allied battleships, colossal ships like the USS Texas, were now turning their massive 14-inch guns toward the shore. Then came the reply. It started as a low, ominous rumble from across the water. He saw flashes of light from the big ships, like a silent lightning storm on the horizon. A few seconds later, the air around him began to tear itself apart. The ground began to heave. Geysers of earth and concrete erupted from the fields. The systematic industrial process of dismantling the Atlantic Wall had begun. Where was the German response? Where were the panzers? Where was the Luftwaffe? Richter scanned the skies and saw nothing but Allied planes. Fighters, bombers, transports. They owned the air completely. German doctrine called for armored counterattacks, but the closest armored unit, the 21st Panzer Division, was paralyzed by confusion and the need for a direct order from Hitler's headquarters. When it finally did move, it did so without air cover into a sky black with Allied fighter bombers, and it was decimated before it ever reached the front. It was in that moment, with his own guns firing and the sky raining steel, that Richter understood this wasn't a fight. It was an extermination. The Allies weren't trying to outmaneuver him, they were simply trying to erase him. This single personal realization of overwhelming force defined the entire Normandy campaign. The tactical part of Richter's brain shut down, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. He was no longer seeing ships and soldiers, he was seeing the system behind them. Through his trembling binoculars, he looked past the endless warships and saw in his mind's eye the assembly lines of Detroit. He pictured factories churning out trucks and engines on a scale Germany could only dream of. The logistics of this invasion, the ability to sustain hundreds of thousands of men on a hostile shore, was not a miracle. It was the simple, brutal result of that unparalleled industrial output. He looked up at the sky, filled with an endless stream of C-47 transport planes and fighter bombers. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew maybe 300 sorties over all of France. The Allies flew over 14,000. For every one German plane in the sky, there were more than 40 Allied ones. The reason wasn't a failure of German courage, it was the factories. And then there were the tanks. Richter knew the reputation of the German panzers. The Tiger and the Panther were technologically superior, feared by Allied crews. But that superiority was a strategic dead end. They were complex, expensive, and difficult to produce and maintain. For every fearsome Tiger tank that rolled off the line, the Allies were stamping out dozens of simpler but brutally effective Sherman tanks. In the entire year of 1944, the U.S. alone would produce over 29,000 tanks. Germany's peak monthly production never topped 2,000. The Allies weren't planning to win tank battles through quality. They were planning to win by burying the panzers under a mountain of steel. This was the new reality. This was the industrial equation of defeat. All the ideological talk of willpower and final victory dissolved in the face of these numbers. Nazi ideology had promised that a unified, determined people could triumph over decadent democracies. But here was the proof. Ideology couldn't stop a bomber. Willpower couldn't sink a battleship. Richter felt a profound, almost spiritual despair. He and his men were good soldiers. They were about to die, not because they were outfought, but because they were outnumbered on a scale that defied human comprehension. They were participants in a contest that was already over. They were like a finely crafted sword facing a steam-powered drop hammer. The outcome of the contest was never in doubt. As the sun climbed higher, the theoretical became a brutal reality. The naval bombardment reached a crescendo, a constant rolling thunder that never ceased. The concrete of the bunker shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling. Through the observation slit, Richter saw the first waves of landing craft hit the shore. Higgins boats dropped their ramps, disgorging American soldiers into the surf. The machine guns in the German pillboxes along Omaha Beach began to chatter, tearing into the ranks of the first men ashore. From his vantage point, Richter saw the terrible drama unfold, the water turning red, the bodies piling up. For a moment, it seemed the defense was holding. But then the industrial equation asserted itself again. Allied destroyers, seeing the slaughter, steamed directly toward the shore, some closing to within 1,000 yards, scraping their hulls on sandbars. They turned their guns on the German bunkers, providing direct fire support in a move that turned the tide on Omaha. At the same time, strange new machines began to appear. Amphibious trucks, the DUKWs, seemingly drove out of the ocean. He saw tanks crawling ashore, some equipped with giant flails to detonate mines, the specialized British Hobart's funnies. The Germans had nothing like them. The scene on the beach below turned from a desperate struggle into a methodical process of annihilation. Richter's own battery was now a prime target. Shells landed closer and closer. A direct hit on one of the gun pits sent a fireball into the air. Another gun was knocked out. His telephone lines went dead. He was isolated, his command shattered. He looked up at the sky one last time. It was a moving ceiling of Allied aircraft. On the sea, the first wave of landing craft was being replaced by a second and a third. Beyond them, the vast armada waited patiently, a conveyor belt of men and material that could, it seemed, run forever. The battle for the beach was still raging, but the outcome had already been decided. It was just a matter of time and tonnage. The hope of victory was gone. It had vanished in the dawn light of June 6th. For Oberleutnant Klaus Richter, the end of the Third Reich came not in a final battle for Berlin, but in a single horrifying moment of revelation. The moment he saw a fleet that filled the horizon, a sky black with enemy planes, and a force that was not just an army, but the full crushing weight of the modern industrial world. It was the morning he knew it was over.